In 1969, Norway discovered something beneath the North Sea that could have changed the country forever. It was oil. And that sounds like the beginning of a success story. But it could just as easily have been the beginning of a disaster. Oil can make a government extremely rich, extremely quickly. And when that happens, it becomes tempting to spend more, borrow more, and promise more. Wages rise, government grows. Other industries become less competitive. The economy becomes dependent on a resource whose price can collapse overnight. Economists call part of this the resource curse, with one mechanism known as Dutch disease. Countries around the world have discovered enormous amounts of oil, gas, or minerals and still ended up with corruption, instability, or economic dependence. So Norway's story is unusual. Norway found oil and somehow used it to become one of the wealthiest and most stable societies in the world. The strange part is that finding the oil wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was deciding what to do with the money and what not to do with it. To understand that, we have to go back to Norway before the oil. Norway wasn't a rich country in the modern sense. Its geography was difficult, farmland was limited, and for generations people depended on fishing, farming, timber, and shipping. But Norway had one major natural advantage: water. Thousands of rivers and waterfalls carried enormous amounts of energy downhill. Norwegian entrepreneurs learned to turn that energy into electricity, helping create industries such as chemicals, metals, and fertilizer. In 1905, Norsk Hydro began producing fertilizer using Norwegian hydropower. This matters because Norway did not suddenly become successful when it discovered oil. It already had infrastructure, industries, technical expertise, and institutions. It wasn't an economic blank slate. Norway had already learned an important lesson. Natural resources are not automatically wealth. They are an opportunity. What matters is what you build around them. Then in the 1960s, international companies began searching for oil beneath the North Sea. Exploration began in 1966, and several early wells failed. Then, just before Christmas in 1969, everything changed. The Ekofisk field was discovered. It was enormous. Production began in 1971, and Norway had entered the oil age. Now imagine the temptation. A relatively small population, a huge offshore resource, and suddenly, billions of dollars of potential wealth beneath the seabed. Why not spend it? Why not build more roads, expand government services, raise wages, and make life better? Norway did spend some of its oil income, but policymakers understood a bigger danger. The problem wasn't simply wasting the money. The problem was allowing oil to reshape the entire economy. Petroleum companies could offer enormous wages, pulling workers away from other industries. Businesses outside petroleum could become less competitive. Government spending could grow, and the country could become increasingly dependent on oil. Then, if oil prices fell, the weakness would be exposed. Norway therefore faced a simple question. Was oil going to serve the economy, or was the economy going to serve oil? Its answer was to build institutions around the petroleum industry. Norway didn't simply hand its resources over to whoever could extract them. The state controlled access through licensing, taxed petroleum profits heavily, and took direct financial participation in the industry. It also created its own national oil company, Statoil, in 1972. The goal was bigger than collecting taxes. Norway wanted to develop the knowledge and expertise needed to manage its own petroleum resources. The basic principle was that the resources belonged to the Norwegian people, not simply to the companies extracting them, and not just to the generation that happened to discover them. They belonged to future generations too. That idea became crucial. Because once Norway had captured the wealth, it faced another question. What should it do with the money? The obvious answer was to spend it. The less obvious answer was to save it. Norway chose to save much of it. In 1990, the government established what became the Government Pension Fund Global. The first money entered the fund in 1996. Instead of allowing petroleum revenue to flood directly into the Norwegian economy, Norway invested much of the wealth abroad. Stocks, bonds, real estate, assets around the world. Think about how counterintuitive that is. You discover a fortune beneath your country, and instead of spending most of it immediately, you turn it into investments spread across the world. That was the point. Norway was creating distance between the resource and the temptation to spend. And it was doing something even more important. It was transforming temporary wealth into permanent wealth. Oil is finite. Once you burn a barrel, it's gone. But if you turn the value of that barrel into financial assets, those assets can continue generating returns long after the oil itself has disappeared. Then, in 2001, Norway introduced a fiscal rule governing how much of the fund the government should normally use. The basic principle was that government spending should broadly follow the fund's expected long-term real return, rather than consuming the underlying wealth. That expected real return was later set at 3%. It wasn't an absolute spending limit every single year, but the philosophy was simple. Don't spend the treasure. Spend only a sustainable portion of what the treasure can generate. And this is where Norway's story becomes bigger than oil. The fund didn't work because someone discovered a clever investment strategy. It worked because Norway already had institutions capable of following rules. It had educated workers, infrastructure, established industries, relatively high trust in government, and a political system capable of thinking beyond a single election cycle. The fund was part of a larger system designed to make short-term political temptation less powerful. Norway still relies heavily on petroleum, and oil and gas remain important to its economy. But the country also understands something fundamental. The oil will eventually become less important. So the goal was never simply to become rich from oil. The goal was to make sure that the oil couldn't make Norway permanently dependent on oil. And that is what makes Norway's story so interesting. Oil did make Norway richer, but oil alone did not create Norway's prosperity. The resource was the accelerant. The institutions were the engine. Norway didn't simply discover a fortune, it built a system capable of surviving one. The oil was buried beneath the North Sea, but the real Norwegian treasure was the system built above it. Because getting rich is one thing, building a country that stays rich is something completely different.